Okay, welcome everyone to our live stream of the Global Azure Virtual 2020 event. It is great to see everyone joining these live events and seeing these, joining these live workshops and watching the presentations and delivering presentations around the globe. So really amazing what we saw the first day. And this is my second session, my second live stream session I'm doing today. So we will talk about Azure Governance and Azure Management. My name is Thomas Maurer. I'm a cloud advocate working for Microsoft. And with Azure Governance and Management, we really want to have a look at how we can actually configure our environment so we can keep the control, but also the speed and the agility of the cloud. So again, super happy in the stream. I see there are already a couple of people in the stream. Hi Simone here in the stream, if I pronounce your name correctly. Thanks for joining. So we will jump right in. And again, I promise you I have a couple of demos. We will start very low on governance and we'll a little bit talk about why it's actually necessary and what's the sense, like why does it make sense. And then we will see about the different iterations and different solutions we are actually having in Azure so you can keep control of your environment. So with that said, the cloud is all about acceleration, speed, and agility, right? So the cloud has a couple of different promises it makes to make sure that actually what are the benefits of the cloud, right? I can now go out and deploy a virtual machine or new service in a couple of minutes instead of waiting for a long time or get approval steps and so on. In some companies even like taking weeks or even months. So that is great about the cloud. And it's also great. So moving fast and breaking things is fantastic, right? As long as the thing you break is your neck, right? And I've seen that in many companies where they went out and said, hey, that's actually great, right? Internally, I had to wait like 2 months until I got my virtual machines or my service ready to basically deploy my application. Now with Azure, I just go out and create everything. And again, this can be very tough basically to do because at the end then you realize, hey, the stuff is not configured securely. We have a huge spend on money on these services, which we can't really have a control. So we need to keep the control of that environment. And to do so, we usually have tools which we call, or process in place, a concept called technical governance. Now, technical governance addresses like 5 high-level pillars, if you will, from deployment acceleration, identity baselines, and so on. But I want to really highlight 3 of them. One, let's start with resource consistency. One of them is resource consistency. I don't know how about you, but when I do things manually, like 5 times, I get 5 different results because just like I messed something up, I didn't build for that, I'm really not doing really well on that. So we need to have something in place which makes it impossible to deploy things with the wrong name or the wrong settings, right? We want to make sure that everything is consistent in the way we want it. Another thing is about security. Think about when you deploy a virtual machine in Azure. By default, it gets assigned a public IP address. And that's, in many cases, great, right? Don't get me wrong. In some cases, you need this public IP address to actually connect to that VM or for the service or whatever. But if you are a company, an enterprise company, which brings your private systems to Azure, you probably don't want to assign a public IP address to servers, which actually just need to stay within your private virtual network, right? So you can also take advantage of this to make sure that everything is configured securely. And the last one is about cost management. In Azure, we have a ton of different services and a ton of different server types and server sizes. So I think one of our VMs called the MV2 VM series, they have options with like over 400 virtual cores, up to like 12 terabytes of memory, and they drain your credit card in like 3 seconds. So you don't want every developer basically spinning up one of these virtual machines, right? Like just because they deploy something small, they should be just able to deploy the right thing, the right sizes, and you can actually keep control of the cost. The other thing I really want to talk about is also many of the companies out there, they have certain regulations in place, right? They have like from like government regulations or even internal regulations, which prevent them from using all of the data centers worldwide. And Azure has far over 50 regions worldwide where customers actually can go out and deploy new services and move their data to. However, in many cases, you want to restrict that, right? And say, hey, my company operates in this country, so I want to keep my data within this country. And you can do that using technical governance. Now, with that said, what happens now in many, many cases is when people realize that they actually need to have control, what actually happens is that they kind of like put a team, like like we call it the cloud custodian team, or basically just the engineers which are responsible for managing the cloud in front of the cloud, right? So every developer or operations person or everyone who wants to deploy something in the cloud needs to go through them. Now, with that process, we move kind of to that traditional approach, right? Where now the time we spend on actually deploying something, we need to deploy something, is not really the technical time. It's really about the process that we have in place. And so this is actually like where we lose again a lot of the advantages we have in the cloud. So therefore, we want to provide our customers with cloud native governance tools. So the cloud custodian team can keep control of the cloud, configure the cloud basically in the way they want it, open it up for their developers, teams, operations people, departments, so they can start going out using the cloud, but having those guardrails in place. And for that, we have a couple set of features and services in place, like management groups, cost management, policies, blueprints. And we're going to have a look at a couple of these. How do you actually, like as a cloud custodian, can actually use that to come to actually set these guardrails for the cloud and configure the Azure in the way I want it. So to make this presentation or this session here a little bit more attractive, we're going to take advantage of Tailwind Traders. Now, Tailwind Traders is our new demo company and represents basically everyone and no one at the same time. So we will have a look at Tailwind Traders as a company, which is an organically grown company, right? As most companies, they have some on-premise stuff. They're also looking at cloud. They have very modern cloud environments, but they also have their traditional VMs and servers and stuff like that. And Tailwind Traders really looks at, like, already started using the cloud, but now realizes that they have a couple of challenges with that. So what are Tailwind Traders cloud governance challenges? And with that, hi Andrew and hi Rabbit. Thank you for joining the live stream. Really appreciate it. And then, so again, if you have any questions in the live stream, please let me know. I will try to answer them while we're going. However, let's go back to the Tailwind Traders cloud governance challenges. So we're going to have a look at different challenges Tailwind Traders is facing, and then have a look at how they can actually solve these challenges using the Azure governance tools. So the first one is the lack of visibility, right? So Tailwind Traders is a large company. They have multiple subscriptions, multiple teams working with Azure, multiple departments working with Azure, deploying multiple services and VMs, and no one really has an overview about what's going on. Another challenge they were facing is that people just said, hey, okay, I'm just going to remove this one because I think we don't need it. And then they deleted something by accident. Since Tailwind Traders is dealing with credit card data, they actually need to be PCI DSS compliant, right? So they have a couple of concerns there, and I'm going to show you how Azure helps you, like being basically helping you get compliant, right? With different regulations. We're going to have a look at PCI DSS, but if you're looking at ISO certifications and others, those apply as well, right? And then the last one is really, we will set this all up, but what we learn is that like while Tailwind Traders is using the cloud, they're given new departments, they give access, they want to create new things. So they want to make sure that everything is already in place when people are using new subscriptions, right? They don't want the admin team to go out and need for that they need to configure and prepare every single subscription. So with that, we're going to have a look at how they can actually do that at scale. So those are the 4 challenges we're looking at. And I have a couple of demos I want to show you in this presentation. So the first challenge we were talking about is visibility, right? So Tailwind Traders really has multiple teams in multiple locations working across multiple subscriptions. Not a single person or team knows in detail every workload that is deployed in Azure, right? Or in that cloud environment. Again, when I speak about Azure, those challenges basically apply to all of the clouds out there, right? So again, how do I get now visibility into that, right? How can I find out what are we actually running? The question really becomes, how does Tailwind Traders get visibility into their complex cloud deployment? So let me introduce you to a tool called Azure Resource Graph. And Azure Resource Graph really will give us an overview about what we're running, not just in our single subscription, but in our whole Azure tenant. And to show you that, I want to show a quick demo here about Azure Resource Graph. So here I'm in the Azure portal, and I'm going to start looking at Azure Resource Graph. And you can see here I'm now in the Azure Resource Graph Explorer. Now on the left side, you can see here what it lists is all our resource providers. Now that's a backend thing in Azure, but basically it helps us then basically create queries. In the middle, you can see here the query pane, where we actually can create those queries, and we're going to use the custom query language, or the keyword query language as it's called right now. But if you're familiar, for example, with log analytics, Azure Sentinel, and other tools in Azure, like if we're doing queries on logs and stuff like that, we are basically using the keyword query language. And again, it was formerly called Custo, so I apologize already if I call it Custo. So what we can now do, we can basically go out and go in these resource providers, and this will help us build those queries. But we can also go out and say, hey, we just like copy paste one or write one directly here in the pane. And this one really goes out and says, hey, list me all the virtual machines. And for that, we're going to trigger the Microsoft Compute Resource Provider. And then summarize that, like the count, and basically by operating system, right? So what I can find out here is really about how many Linux VMs and how many Windows VMs do I have. So if I run this query now, and you can see here, I run this, I get immediately like some results here. You can see here I run 30 Linux VMs and 30 Windows VMs in Azure, right? Now, again, numbers are great and they help usually, but if you're dealing, for example, with management, you probably want to have some nice charts there as well. So what you can do here, you can basically go to charts, and then let's select bar chart, and you can see here nice fancy charts showing me, okay, I have the same amount of Linux and Windows virtual machines in my environment, right? And I can basically go out and show that to my manager to get him like that information so he can show it on a PowerPoint during a meeting with his manager. Now, what I can do now, I can go and save that query. So I don't need to type it next time. So I'm just going to save it. And I can pin this to the dashboard. Now, if I go back to the dashboard in the portal, I think the dashboard is one of the most underestimated like tools in Azure, right? Because when we talk about how they're using Azure, we're always saying, hey, we're going to use the Azure CLI, we're going to use Azure DevOps, we're going to use Azure PowerShell, we basically do all of that, right? And we're saying, hey, don't you use the portal. However, for showing data, the portal is fantastic, right? So I can basically go out and build these fancy dashboards. And in the meantime, I also saw some other people joining, like Andre van den Berg, Heiko, thank you very much, sir. Marco from Serbia, Rohit, I hope I pronounced that right. So thank you very much here for joining. So again, I want to show you that in a little bit. I created some advanced dashboard here. So instead of just having that one, oh, sorry about that. So here I have an advanced version of the dashboard. So you can see here, I basically have queries which basically show me the top 10 resources. I can see here, hey, okay, there are like lots of virtual machine running in my environment, disks, and so on. So I can actually see what's going on there. I can see more information about VMs, storage, networking, databases, web services, basically everything you can run in Azure, right? And if I want to edit that, I can just basically go out and say, hey, okay, I want to modify that query, what generates that chart, and then I can basically go and modify this. Now you can see here, you can easily set up like dashboards like this using Azure Resource Graph. And again, if you're dealing with never did that, you can also use like for example Azure Log Analytics and other tools, or Azure Monitor, to basically pin things to the dashboard. So I've seen some great solutions out there where people actually were pointing out the dashboard and like build like one for security, one for the networking data, one for monitoring, one for inventory, and so on. So the Azure dashboard, really great solution. But again, Azure Resource Graph is the thing which gives us the insight what is going on in our Azure environment. So I think I have a question here which I quickly want to have a look at. And so it says, so transparency of resources is necessary as client requests, or is that governance option? No, this is one of the governance options, right? So like having really like a look at this is really, you want to know what you're actually running in your environment. So you want to make sure that you see what is going on. So Azure Resource Graph really gives you much more than what I just showed you. But most importantly, to tell you is that Azure Resource Graph gives you a visibility over all your Azure resources, not just within one subscription, but over your whole tenant, right? So you can have a look at all the virtual machines running in all the subscriptions in your environment, or all, I'm not just talking about virtual machines, it can also be about all the other Azure resources. I showed you how you can do these queries in the portal. However, you can also use Azure PowerShell, the CLI, or the APIs to basically work against Azure Resource Graph and get that data and then probably export it to another system. And what's also very important is it's using as I mentioned, the keyword query language. And if you have a subscription where you have hundreds of virtual machines, and if you ever did a get ACVM in one of these subscriptions, you know that it takes a couple of excuse me, minutes basically to get that data back, right? So the great thing about Azure Resource Graph, it caches that data in the background. So if you do a query, you just get a couple of seconds and you get all that information. It doesn't matter how large your subscriptions or your environment is, right? How many resources you have deployed. Since we all cache that information about these resources, you get a very fast answer and you can figure out what's going on very quickly. So hi Tim, thanks for joining as well. So the next challenge I want to talk about is about like modifying or deleting resources by accident. So one of the tasks here is a junior admin tasked with saving money deleted a VM that appeared to have a minimal utilization in the last 2 weeks. It was only used to perform end of the month to perform complex localization of their organizational and global account. So basically what happened is, okay, and the team really stressed this enough, say it was a junior admin because it doesn't happen to us senior admins, which of course is not true, like this happens to everyone, right? But so basically you got tasked, okay, we need to save some money. Please go out and clean up the resources. Now he saw that this VM is not really used for the last 2 weeks. So he assumed that, okay, it's probably not necessary, so I'm going to remove it. Now, as you can see, it was used, but just at the end of the month. Now, the best solution here, actually what we would do in best practice is we would shut down that virtual machine when we don't use it, and then basically start it up when we need to do these calculations. But as you know, what is best practice and what people actually do in production sometimes has a long way to go, right? So again, it happened, he removed that virtual machine, but actually he should not even be able to remove that virtual machine, right? So let's have a look how we can actually protect against this and how does Tailwind Traders prevent accidental changes and allows ops to understand which resource should not be deleted. So let me show you a quick demo about Azure Locks and tags. And I'm sure you have, if you're working with Azure, you already have seen that before, but I want to quickly show you what you actually can do with that. So here I'm back in the Azure portal and I'm listing all my resource groups. Now again, a resource group is a logical container of your resources. Now what I can do here is basically I can go and click on a resource group, I click on delete resource group, and now it only asks me about the name of that resource group. So are you really sure you want to read it? And then you need to enter the name of the resource group. And again, this is probably not really challenging because the name of that resource group really shows up like 3 times on that screen. And what happens now if I enter this and click on that, it will delete the resource group and every resource in there. And that's how easy it is. And that should be that easy, right? But how can I change this? For my production systems, I probably don't want someone go out and just delete the resource group by accident, right? So what I can do here is I can go to logs and add a log. I can give that a name. And you can see here I have 2 options. I have read only and delete. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. I will also give that a note. So here we are, and I want to make some note here as well. When you have a description field or a note field, please use it. Write something in there, why it's there, what it actually means. So when you're not at work and someone else of your colleagues needs to pick this up, he's going to be very happy that he knows why this log is there or why you configured something in the way it is. So again, I'm going to say, okay, do not delete, it's production system. And then I have that log in place. And now if I try to delete that resource group, you can see here, I enter the name, and you can also see the affected resources. So I have a couple of resources running in that resource group. So if I now go and click on delete, you can see here, it will not remove the resource group and all the resources in there. I get an error message saying, hey, this resource group is locked, right? So I can't delete these resources. Now, the next thing I wanted to figure out is like, why can I not delete this? Like, okay, so I could use, for example, tags, and tags are usually a name value metadata, which I can add to Azure resources. So I'm going to say, hey, production, do not delete. And then I get that do not delete tag here, and I can immediately see it in the portal. Hey, this is something you should not delete because it's a production system. And you can also see that in the resource group list itself. Now, again, this is a very visible use of tags in Azure, right? Tags are much more widely used in Azure than just this. We use that, for example, to tag resources and say, hey, which department are you belonging to? Or we use it to say, hey, which cost center are you belonging to? So you can use then Azure Cost Management and basically say, hey, show me all the costs for a specific cost center, right? Or for a specific department or team or a specific project or whatever you want to use it. The other part where you can, for example, also use tags is if you use Azure Update Management. Azure Update Management is a service which allows you to patch servers. Now, what I've seen with customers is they usually don't want to patch all the systems, all the servers at the same time. They basically create different groups of servers. So group 1 gets patched on Tuesday, group 2 gets patched on Thursday. And so we can actually put a tag, like an update group tag to it. And then Azure Update Management can take care of that and say, hey, okay, I'm going to look at this specific tag. And if you're in group 1, you're going to get patched on Tuesday. So it's a very good way of using these tags in there. So this is a quick show about logs and tags and what they can do. I want to dive a little bit deeper here and tell you a little bit more about logs. So logs, again, they basically, all the resources within the scope inherit the same log. So if I do it on a resource group, everything in that resource group gets inherit that log. You have 2 logs types I have seen. One is the cannot delete and the other one is the read only. Cannot delete means the resource or the resource group can be modified. You can change the resources, you can change the settings, but you can't delete them. If you do it read only, that means they can't be deleted and they can't be modified, right? So they can be very handy if you set up a subscription, for example, like the networking part, and you don't want any admin to really mess with that networking part. So you can say, hey, this is a read-only piece, and you can basically go out and deploy stuff, but you can't really modify it. When it comes to tag, again, this is it basically allows me to assign metadata to Azure resources, which I then can use. And usually it's just a name value pair where I can use, and then I can basically help that doing queries on this and get a view on those specific tags, right? I think you can tag right now resources up to with like 50 tags, depending on the resource. So you can have multiple tags, obviously, for the resources as well. So I got a question. Help me to understand availability zone, availability set, fault domain, and update domain. To be honest, I don't really have time for this in this session, but we can absolutely talk about this a little bit later in another session or offline to that. And then we have another question here coming in. Azure Log overrides the RBAC permissions. So kind of yes. So if you have permission to delete something using RBAC, but there is a lock in place, you won't be able to delete it, right? However, if you have like owner permissions, you can go and remove the lock. But it's not that it prevents you from like hackers or something like that. It really is just there to prevent you from accidental changes or deletion, right? So when you try to delete something and there's a lock in place and you realize that, you probably think twice or even 3 times why you want to delete that, right? So it does not really in that case override it. You can still go out if you have enough permissions to remove the lock, but you can't really go out and delete that. So it's really just a protection for you. But you're absolutely right. I see where this question has come from. You can also set the RBAC rules in the right way, right? However, you still want to make sure that, like, sometimes even if someone with admin account can't go out and just delete things. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about now, you saw tagging, right? So how does Tailwind Traders ensure that all the resources in the resource group now have this, the appropriate tag? So you saw me that I tagged the resource group, but now the resources within that resource group are not tagged yet. So how do we do that? With that, I want to quickly show you how you can use Azure Policies for that, to basically do that. And Azure Policies really are like, kind of for me as a server person, it's kind of like group policies on steroids, right? So it allows me basically to configure the Azure environment in the way we want it. I'm going to show you this quickly here. So let me show you. So I'm back in my resource group here. And if I go to policy, you can see here now, I can go to definitions. And I can then go and say, hey, I only want to show me policies for tags, right? So we have a couple of built-in policies already ready for you to use, right? You can also bring your own policies. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a bit. But again, you can basically go out and take some of the built-in ones. So let's have a look at the built-in ones. And there is one which I call inherit a tag from a resource group. So that seems to be right. So now if I go to that policy or policy definition, you can see here, I get the name of it, I get a description, what it can do, and then I get a lot of information around it. And you can also see that this is actually written in JSON, right? So you get the definition in a JSON format, which you then can use or have a look at. Again, this is also how you would write your own one. And I will talk a little bit about that in a bit. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to assign this policy. So first I'm going to select the scope for it. So this can be a management group, a subscription, or a resource group. So in our case, we're going to assign it to this specific resource group, right? So it will belong and be inherited to everything within that resource group. So as I said, I give it a description, so we know what it is. And I basically going to say which tag is going to be used for that. And then I'm going to assign it. Now, if I go back to my resource group here, you can see here in the compliance view that I now have non-compliant resources, right? So because they don't have inherited that tag, the resources here show up, right? All the resources I have here show up. Now, it will not automatically go out and tag these resources. For that, I now need to create a remediation task. So I'm going to create a remediation task. And you can see here then which are all the the resources impacted by this, and I say, okay, remediate. And this will create the remediation task. And then this will take a while. You can see here it's in progress. And if you go a step further, we can see here that it's actually completed. And you can see here that now all the resources within that resource group inherit the same tag from the resource group. So they're all tagged now being a production system, and you should not delete them. So that was tagging and policy remediation. So I quickly want to talk a little bit more about policies. I used certain names here. I want to quickly clarify this. So a policy itself is actually a rule that will be enforced. And then I use the word initiative. So initiative is usually a collection of policies, right? So if you want to do like configure something in a specific way, it usually doesn't take just one rule. It maybe takes a couple of rules. And so you can put them together in an initiative. And then we have the assignment, and that's basically the scope where we actually go and assign that policy. So where it actually applies. And again, this can be on management groups, and we talk about management groups in a little bit later. This can be on a subscription level. So everything in the subscription is basically like the policy will apply to everything in that subscription. You can put it down to a resource group level. You could even go down and put it on a resource level. So let me quickly look. We have a couple of questions here. Yes, there's a good example. Similar to the AD object prevented lock. Yes, that's a very good example of that. What about inherent permissions from RBAC? Well, that's also something which also happens basically automatically. So policies are basically settings and other stuff which we can do, and like in that case I just took tags, but policies can do much more. Now with RBAC is the case that if you set like me as an owner for a specific resource group, it will automatically inherit to all the resources down there within that resource group. So, talking about Azure policies. Now, as I said, there are some built-in policies which you can use to configure your environment. So you can, for example, go out and say, hey, I only want to like limit my Azure environment to a specific set of virtual machines. I can basically go out and say, hey, I only want people in that subscription to deploy to those specific Azure regions. They can only deploy certain services and so on. You could also see how I can actually use it for tags to like inherit tags from the resource group. And what it does is basically does a real-time evaluation of the environment and enforcement. And very important here, what I want to mention is there's two ways of using these policies. One way is kind of like in an audit mode, right? Where you go in and say, hey, I don't want anyone to deploy this type of virtual machine, or I don't want anyone to deploy a public IP address to a virtual machine. And then if you go to audit mode and someone does it, you will see, hey, this resource is not compliant. Someone did that, and it will pop up, and you can basically go out and see why the person did that. And that's also what we recommend if you start, right? You start with auditing your environment. If you put a policy in place, you first go out and audit to see what are the resources not configured in the right way. And then there's also a way of blocking that, right? So you can go out and say, hey, okay, I don't even want to allow someone to do that. So if he wants to deploy that VM with a public IP address, the deployment will fail, right? And we'll tell him you can't deploy it because there's a policy in place. Now, again, these are like two levels, which absolutely make sense. In a perfect world, you would go and enforce it and say, hey, you can't deploy things which are not compliant. But if you already started with Azure, you probably don't want to break anything, right? So that's when you do the auditing part. I see a question around Azure Blueprints, and I will come back to a little bit later to talk about Blueprints a little bit later. Another part of Azure Policy, by the way, is it cannot just be used for the Azure environment. It can also integrate in things like the AKS, like Azure Kubernetes Service for your Kubernetes cluster running in Azure. And it also integrates perfectly into other tool sets like Azure DevOps, and I will talk about that in a bit. So I told you that there are some built-in policies, right? But however, we don't have everything in place for all the different options you want to have. So you can also bring your custom policies. And one thing you could do is basically, instead of just building that, we have a GitHub repository for Azure Policies, where people already uploaded a lot of their custom policies. So you can basically go out and see, hey, is there anything which I can use or I want, and basically use that and upload that to your Azure account. If there's nothing, you can write your own policy. There's very good documentation on it, how you can write custom policies. And then if you maybe write something, you can basically also, again, contribute to that Azure Policy repository, so someone else can use your Azure policy you have written and doesn't need to spend more time on it. And then people telling me, okay, hey, Thomas, this is all great, but we're already pretty advanced. We're using Azure DevOps to deploy resources to Azure, right? And the problem we are having now, we're checking in code, we're checking in our ARM templates, this is going to deploy and it's going to operate and work. It fires against the Azure environment. And now there's a policy actually preventing that. And that can be like the last resource which actually deployed. And so we wait for 2 hours and at the end we get an error, right? Again, absolutely a problem. But since Azure DevOps and Azure Policy are integrating into each other, so you can take advantage of like policy configuration before you actually deploy the resources or your software or your ARM template to Azure to basically validate, are they actually compliant with my Azure policies in place. Good. So this was a quick look at Azure policies, but I want to show you a little bit more of that. The next question really is, how does Tailwind Traders assess PCI DSS compliance on migrated resources? So Tailwind Traders recently migrated a couple of resources to Azure, and now they want to figure out, are those resources actually compliant with PCI DSS? And again, when I speak about PCI DSS, this is just one of the regulations. There are multiple more which we can have a look at, which we also have prepared in Azure. And again, we will quickly have a look at this. So let me quickly have a look at Audit PCI DSS compliance. Now I'm here back in the Azure portal, and you can see here I'm back with my Azure resource groups. And now if I go into a resource group, here is my resource group where I actually have all the migrated resources, right? And those are virtual machines, and those are also things like, again, like for example, automation accounts and log analytics and much, much more. So what I go into policy, and then I go to assign initiative. So I'm going to select the initiative I want to. And if I see here, I'm going to list all my built-in policies or policies initiatives. So what I have here, I have a list of them. And you can see here we have an initiative which says Audit PCI version 3.2.1 2008. And so we have already a preset of that built into Azure. But what's even more interesting here is that it says controls and deploy specific VM extensions to support audit requirements. Now, PCI DSS, for example, does not just obviously have some rules for the Azure environment. There's also about how is your operating systems or how are your applications configured. And again, Azure policies alone are for the Azure environment, but we have something as called Azure guest configuration policies. Now, Azure guest configuration policies allow us to basically also go into the and configure and audit the virtual machine operating system, right? So we're going to have a look at that, how that looks like. So we're going to use this one, and then give it a description, and then basically go and assign it. And now we're going to see here, it's not started yet, but after a while it will go out and basically audit that. So you can see here, again, like not started yet. And if I go into it, you can now see here my status here for that. So it says not started. After a while, if you come back, it will basically go out and have checked all the resources and will say, hey, you're not compliant, right? So some of your resources are not compliant. And then you can see here are all the policies listed which are auditing my environment. You can see here, not compliant. And then I also have obviously ones which I am compliant with. So, however, I'm a little bit more interested in the ones I'm not compliant with, right? So let's have a look at these settings. So one of them, for example, is I go here, is deploy prerequisites to audit Windows VMs that do not have a maximum password age of 70 days, right? So I can go here and see, hey, and this is actually a operating system setting, right? This has nothing to do with Azure. This is really about the operating system. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to create a remediation task, and then I can see here all the resources which will be impacted, and click on remediate, and then that will actually deploy this to that, and then I can see here if I'm compliant or not compliant with that. So this is more or less about guest configuration policies, right? And I can use that for Windows machines, but also for Linux machines as well. So again, I have a couple of other questions here, which I'm going to have a look. I have Dev here quickly has it. I have an issue, people creating their own Azure subscriptions through free account or Visual Dev Essentials and then convert it to pay as you go using a company credit card. How to stop this? So this is a great question. I think we will come that a little bit later to that specific question. So the next thing I want to talk about is how does Tailwind Traders ensure that new subscriptions and resources deployed to do subscription align with PCI DSS, right? So now what we are doing here is basically saying, hey, okay, some departments want to create their own subscriptions, and that's absolutely fine. So we give them the rights to create their own subscriptions. But however, we want to take care that they are configured in the right way. And for that, we are going to use Azure Blueprints. And we're going to have a look again at the PCI DSS blueprint, but I'm going to show you there's much, much more than this. So here I'm back in the Azure portal, and if I go to Blueprints, so I'm looking for Blueprints here in the portal, you can see here I'm landing page on Blueprints, and I can basically go create new blueprints, apply to a scope, or track assignments. So in my case, I just really want to create a new blueprint here. So instead of starting with a blank blueprint, right, and a blueprint really is like a template for a new subscription, if you will, we're going to use one of these samples here. So we have a couple of samples here, and if you look at it in there, we have things like ISO 27001, we have, for example, UK official, UK NHS, we also have, as you can kind of like imagine, we have PCI DSS, and a couple of others, right? So we already have prepared a couple of these things, and they already have the right policies in place and much, much more. Now, on the top of this list, you can also see that we have what we call basic networking VNet. Now, a blueprint does not just include policies. A blueprint can also be an ARM template to deploy certain resources, and it can also already configure RBAC, right? So you can use, and I will show you that in a little bit. You don't have just policies, you have ARM templates to deploy resources, and then you can also configure RBAC. So in our case, we're going to choose the PCI DSS one. That's what we want. And so we're going to give that blueprint a name, take that sample, and then we can select the management group where we actually want to use that. And now we can see the artifacts. And the artifacts are really the parts, what is part of this blueprint. And you can see here, for example, the one like deploy threat detection on SQL servers, encrypt storage accounts, or allow, for example, only different locations, right? So you can see here actually a lot of different things going on. This can be this is just a sample set of artifacts for that blueprint. You can also go out and add your own ones, right? So if you have some additional requirements you want to add to that blueprint, you can just add these artifacts here. So I'm going to save this definition, and now I have that blueprint. However, this is now in draft mode. So to use that blueprint, I need to publish it. I'll give it a version, and then I'm going to say publish. So now this is published, and now I can basically go out and do assignments, right? You can see here now it's published. And now I can go out and assign that blueprint. Now I'm going to select the subscription which already is there. However, I can also obviously create a new subscription. So I'm going to assign that to that subscription. And you can see here also you can do a lock assignment. These are the same locks I talked before. Now, this is really about if I now deploy a virtual network or a storage account, Should there be a lock assigned to these resources? And if so, should it be do not delete or just read only, right? Again, so if I deploy some virtual network with my blueprint, I probably want to say, hey, this is read only because I want to give you everything, but I want to make sure that you're not going out and modifying things. And then I need to set the parameters for the specific artifacts, right? So you can see here now they show up. So those are the artifacts which I have in there. And I basically need to configure these. So the first one basically says, hey, okay, there's a rule that we actually need to limit where you actually deploy your resources. Now, what I want to do here is I want to go out and say, since Tailwind Traders right now is a US company, I want to go and say, hey, the only allowed locations are the US data centers. So you can only go out and deploy in the US data centers. And again, so this is a very easy way of how you can set a limit, like where people can actually go out and which Azure region they can deploy resources. The other thing is that for the auditing logs of the SQL servers, which we need for DCI, PSS, PCI compliance, is we also need to have a storage account. Now, the blueprint will create that storage account. However, we will also want to configure the name of the resource group where the storage account is placed. So we can set that artifact right here while we are creating it. And then this blueprint will be basically assigned to the specific subscription. And now if we go and have a look at the assignments, we can now see which blueprint is assigned to which specific subscription here. So this is, again, very easy way of going out and giving these templates basically. So whenever now the marketing department or the development department or whoever creates a new subscription, everything is already in place in the right configuration, right? So that's what I can take blueprints for. And I want to show you a little bit more what that is. So blueprints really are there to streamline the environment creation process. Again, you can see, hey, I already have RPEC configured in the right way. I already have certain resources deployed. I already have policies in place, right? So I can easily do that. And then the question always comes up, how can I then actually create this blueprint? What does actually make sense? And you saw me using a sample, but again, in your company, you maybe have different needs, right? So what actually usually happens is a cloud engineer, cloud architect, and maybe people from the different teams are coming together to say, how does actually that need to be look like? Most of the time, also someone from security and networking is there. So we need to know who is actually, or what do we actually need? And the first thing they go out, they're going to define that blueprint. So again, this can be ARM templates. ARM templates are Azure Resource Manager templates, so you can do infrastructure as code again. So if we're going to say, hey, every subscription has one specific virtual network in place, has storage accounts in place, and so on. Then you can do policy definitions. So you have seen policies. We can already say, hey, every subscription created gets that policy assigned. And then I can also configure role-based access. So if I have a role-based access concept, I can basically go out and say, hey, these specific groups, for example, are contributors to this subscription or that resource group, which we always create, and so on. So I can really already have everything basically in place for this. One option we will have in the future is also to run custom scripts. So you can also run some scripts when a subscription is created. And then basically we have now that as a foundation when we create new subscriptions, right? So they basically get that blueprint assigned when we create them, and then we have that in place. You can versionize these blueprints again. So when you do later on changes, you probably want to have different versions to do that. And then you have different built-in blueprints already ready for you. You saw the samples, right? So I had, for example, different ones for ISO, I had for NHS, I had the PCI DSS compliance one, and there are much more in there as you have seen. So I can start with that. And that's also what I recommend to people. Even though you probably don't need to be compliant with one of these regulations, use one of these to basically get started, right? So you have already a couple of things in place which you actually need, so you can use that. We are, by the way, using blueprints also within Microsoft, right? So you can imagine that our engineering teams have access to create their own subscriptions. However, obviously IT wants to keep that a little bit under control, and so we are using blueprints internally. So every subscription a team creates basically has already some pre-configured settings in there and some policies in place to make sure that we also deploy in a secure way. So now, again, I showed you now a couple of different things here about like how you can basically use tools like policies and stuff like that. And I use the word a lot, like management groups, right? And like management group is kind of, well, it's not new anymore, but it was kind of like a long time we did miss that feature. And I'm going to show you how you can use that. So how does Tailwind Traders organize and simplify the subscription management, right? So that is exactly where management groups come in. I'm not going to show you a demo on this, but so what it basically allows us to do is letting us build that hierarchy, right? So we can say, hey, we always have that, every department basically is a management group, for example, and then we can basically say, hey, instead of assigning rules or policies or RBAC or Azure Security Center configurations on a subscription level, you can also assign it on a management group level, and then all the subscriptions with underneath that management group basically inherit these settings, right? So I'm going to show you this. This is a small example here. And even though you don't use management groups today, there's always the root management group, right? Every Azure tenant has the root management group. And then you can build your own management groups underneath that. So you can, in this example, we have created one called prod. This has RBAC and policies applied. And then we have one called pre-prod. And both of them have multiple subscriptions underneath that management group. And so I'm going to go and assign RBAC and policies to the prod environment, to that management group, and all the subscriptions within prod will have those policies and RBAC assigned. And the same thing happens to the pre-prod environment, where I'm going to say, hey, pre-prod, we have different RBACs and policies. So we're going to basically edit them and put them on the management group. And again, everything gets inherited. You can also have multiple levels of this. It's not just limited to like one level. So you can have a management group under a management group under a management group. So you can really build your structure, your hierarchical structure, however, whatever depends on your organization. We have like really organizations, they are doing that on environments like different departments. So you can say, hey, this department here, all their subscriptions are underneath that management group. And on top level, we can basically go out and say, hey, those are the policies which you need to follow, and we assign that to the management group. So, quick overview. We talked about in this session, or this presentation, we talked about management groups. Again, helps us to quickly organize in a different hierarchy. We talked about policies, which give you basically real-time enforcements and compliance and assessment features, so you have more control about your environment. To streamline your creation process, we basically have Azure Blueprints, and then to get visibility, we have Azure Resource Graph. What I didn't show you here in this session is cost management, but cost management really has a big part of it, and a lot of these tools, like for example tags I showed you and stuff like that, is used in cost management as well, right? So those tools really help us to keep our Azure environment underneath control. So let me quickly look before I go forward. I have a couple of questions. So about naming. So there's one from Andre, naming conventions. Yes, you can do like naming convention stuff with Azure Policies, and then also use that in Blueprints. So whenever you deploy, for example, as you said, a storage account, you can make sure that it is named correctly. Again, be very careful with that because also some services create storage accounts in the background and they just use random names for this. So be careful with that. But yes, absolutely. And Blueprints are still in preview? Yes. So last time I checked, Blueprints are still currently in preview. That's absolutely the case. Yes. Policies and management groups, resource graph, they should be all out of preview, but Blueprints are currently, I think, still in preview. We can go on and have a look at it, but so far, I think last time I checked, which is a couple of weeks back, it was still in preview. So what did I just show you? And I think we're going back to that. I really like that picture. Now, you saw the tools like management groups, policies, and blueprints with RBACs and policies, tagging, and stuff like that. And those are all tools and basically cloud native governance tools you can use as the cloud custodian team, or the team which is in charge of managing the cloud, and basically configure the cloud in the way you want it, and then give teams, developers, operations people actually access to that. But again, when they deploy something, you are still in control, right? They have the speed. They can quickly go and create resources, delete resources as they want, but you are in control of it, what they can deploy and how they can deploy it and where they can deploy it and so on. So before I close this, I really quickly want to show you a high-level architecture slide of Azure management. And so we start here on the left side, right, where we are basically, as an Azure customer, we are interacting with Azure using the portal, PowerShell, the CLI, our management APIs, and so on. And then when we are interacting with Azure, we are actually interacting with the Azure Resource Manager. And here's where the whole magic happens, right? Azure Resource Manager is basically in charge of like all the subscription management of logs, RBACs, policies, blueprints, tags, search, templates, and so on. So this is all done by the Azure Resource Manager. That's a really powerful tool. And today, well, I shouldn't say today, but like until last year, basically they were used to manage Azure services, right? So we could like basically use it for virtual machines, app service fabric, Kubernetes clusters, databases, AI services, and so on. Now, people said, okay, hey, this is great. Why can't we not just use it for things which are not in Azure, right? So, and that's where Azure Arc comes in. And Azure Arc basically extends the Azure Resource Manager and allows us to add non-Azure resources. Today, these are servers. This can be physical, virtual servers running on-prem, running at other cloud providers. It can be Kubernetes clusters. It can be Azure Data Services. So those are the things we can currently, which we announced at last Ignite, what we can actually onboard to Azure Resource Manager today. And again, this is not meant to replace everything you're doing, like with your local tools. You can still use your server, Windows Server Admin Center, for example, your Kubernetes cluster tools on-prem. You don't rely on the cloud, but you can actually use the Azure management to get that single control plane to use that. So if you want to learn more about Azure Governance, go to Microsoft Learn. We created a specific collection of Learn modules in Azure, which are dedicated to governance in Azure. So if you follow that link here on that screen, you get basically to Microsoft Learn. Microsoft Learn is a free learning tool online, not just for Azure, but also for Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365, and so on. And those are all free. You have different learning paths. You have different modules where you can go through and learn. You can even use that to like prepare for exams, but also if you just want to learn about a certain technology. And the great thing is it's not just about like text which you can read or videos you can watch or like questions you can answer to see if you actually learned something and if you're right about it. You have all of that, but you also get a free sandbox environment. So if you're not even having a Azure subscription, you can just create an account here, which is a free, just a Microsoft account, no credit card needed, nothing else needed. You go out and basically you can start training and trying out to deploying Azure and configuring Azure and so on. Very great. If you haven't tested it, go out to Microsoft Learn. We are constantly updating the modules. We're constantly adding new modules, new learning modules, so you can go out and learn for that. And if you're not sure what to learn, this is also great. So Microsoft Learn is really role-based, so you can select your role. You can say, for example, like I'm an administrator. So basically I say I'm interested in learning paths and modules which are tied to an Azure administrator, and then Microsoft Learn will recommend that. If you're an IoT developer, it will recommend you modules for IoT development, and so on. But again, we created here a collection. Just follow that link if you want to learn more about it. And then I also recommend that you have a look at certification. So this always helps me to basically learn the things I need. We have the Azure Fundamentals exam and also the Azure Administrator exam, which is, by the way, there's also a new version coming. This is like AC 103, which was the current one, and then the new version will be AC 104, and you basically can become a Azure Administrator. So with that, I really want to say thank you for everyone who joined. In that live stream. We are slightly over time than I planned. I will follow up with you. Please hit me up on Twitter. I saw that one question I didn't really answer, so please hit me up on Twitter or on my blog. You can basically go out and there is a form you can fill out, so we can discuss that offline for your question to see how we can address this. Again, thank you very much for joining that session. I hope it was helpful. And join the rest of the Global Azure Virtual Event 2020. Thank you very much.